I thought my best friend was just being overprotective. But the way he looked at me that night, it wasn't anger. It wasn't jealousy. It was something I wasn't ready to understand. The night Maya came home late for the third time that week, I told myself it was nothing. I was sitting in our living room, the one we had painted together 2 summers ago, a warm shade of cream that she had picked out from 17 different swatches, holding each one against the wall in the late afternoon light, asking me which one felt like home. I had laughed at her then, kissed her on the cheek and said, "They all look the same to me, baby." She had rolled her eyes with that smile of hers, the one that started slow like sunrise and ended with the tiny dimple just below her left eye. I was sitting in that room, on the couch we had argued over buying because I thought it was too expensive and she thought it was perfect, under the lamp she had found at a thrift store and spent 3 weekends rewiring herself because she said she didn't want to pay an electrician for something she could learn on YouTube. I was sitting in the life we had built together, and I was watching the front door, and I was telling myself it was nothing. It was 11:47 p.m. She had texted at 7:30 to say she was working late. I had heated up the dinner. I made pasta, her favorite, with the sun-dried tomatoes she loved and the kind of parmesan that comes in a block instead of the green shaker can because she always said the real thing mattered, and I had eaten alone and I had put her plate in the fridge, and I had sat down to watch television, and somewhere around 9 p.m. I had stopped watching and started waiting. I heard her key in the lock at 11:49. She came in quietly, the way you come in when you think someone might be sleeping, setting her bag down gently, toeing off her shoes near the door. She was wearing her gray blazer, the one she wore when she had important meetings, and her hair was down instead of in the ponytail she always wore to work. She smelled like cold air and something else I couldn't quite name, something that didn't smell like our apartment or her office or anything in the landscape of our shared life. "You're still up," she said when she saw me, not surprised, just observing. "You're late," I said. "I texted you. You texted me at 7:30. She sat her keys down on the little wooden table by the door, the one we called the landing pad because everything landed there: mail, receipts, forgotten grocery lists, the accumulated debris of daily life. She looked tired, but there was something else in her face, something underneath the tiredness, and I couldn't read it. I had spent 6 years learning every expression Maya owned, cataloging them the way a scientist might catalog rare specimens, and this one was new to me. "I'm sorry," she said, "it was a long day." "Okay," I said. She went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, saw her plate. She stood there for a moment with the refrigerator door open, the cold light falling across her face, and I watched her from the couch and felt something small and sharp moving around in my chest, like a splinter working its way in deeper. "You made pasta," she said. "Yeah. Thank you, Daniel." She took the plate out, heated it up, came and sat at the kitchen table instead of beside me on the couch like she normally would. I watched her eat. She was looking at her phone. I turned back to the television, which was showing something I hadn't been watching for 2 hours. That was a Tuesday. I want to be honest with you about something because this story doesn't make sense unless I am. I was not at that point a particularly paranoid person. I had never been the jealous type, or at least that's what I had always told myself and what Maya had always confirmed. "You're the most secure person I know," she had told me once early in our relationship when I had shrugged easily about her going to a work conference without me. "It's one of the things I love most about you." I held on to that. I wore it like a badge. I am secure. I am not jealous. I am not the kind of man who checks his girlfriend's phone or monitors her location or sits up at midnight cataloging the minutes of her lateness. That was not who I was. But something had been shifting for weeks, maybe longer, and I had been refusing to look at it directly, the way you refuse to look directly at the sun. You can see it in your peripheral vision, that bright and burning thing, but to turn and face it fully felt like it might blind you. It had started small. Maya was a graphic designer at a mid-sized marketing firm, and she had always been passionate about her work, always brought home a kind of excited energy when a project was going well. But lately the energy had changed. She was still working late, actually she was working later than ever, but the excitement had been replaced by something more guarded. She would stop conversations mid-sentence when I walked into the room. She had changed her phone password, which I only discovered by accident when I tried to use it to check the time during a power outage. She laughed differently at dinner when something on her phone made her smile, quickly, privately, turning the screen away with emotion so practiced it didn't even look like emotion anymore. I noticed these things, I filed them away. I told myself stories about them that made them harmless. She was working on a surprise for me, our anniversary was coming up. She was dealing with something at work she didn't want to bring home. She was going through something personal she wasn't ready to talk about. She was tired, she was stressed. She was human, and humans have private lives, and loving someone didn't mean owning every corner of them. I told myself all of these things. But on that Tuesday night, watching her eat pasta alone at the kitchen table while the lamp she had rewired herself cast its warm light over her face, I felt the splinter in my chest push a little deeper, and I thought, for the first time in actual words, in a sentence I couldn't take back once I'd thought it. She might be seeing someone else. The thought, once arrived at, was impossible to unthink. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay beside her in the dark. She fell asleep quickly, the way she always did, one hand tucked under her cheek, her breathing going slow and even within minutes of her head hitting the pillow, and I stared at the ceiling and felt the thought moving through me like something with teeth. I tried to be rational about it. I tried to audit the evidence the way a reasonable person might. Okay, she was working late. She had always worked late sometimes. Okay, she had changed her phone password. She had a right to privacy. Okay, she seemed distant. People went through distant phases. Okay, she smelled like something I couldn't name when she came home. She had been outside in the cold and people smell like the world they walk through. None of it held. Because here is the thing that no amount of rational auditing could explain away. The feeling, not jealousy, not yet, not exactly. Something older and quieter than jealousy. Something that lived below the level of specific fears in the body rather than the mind. A low-frequency dread, the feeling of standing in a room you've lived in your whole life and suddenly not recognizing the walls. I had felt it before once a long time ago when I was 11 years old and my mother sat me down at the kitchen table with a very particular look on her face. A look that said, "What I am about to tell you will change the architecture of your world." And then she told me that my father had been living a second life for 3 years, a life with another woman in another city, a life so complete it had a house and a dog. This was the part that broke something in me I was still finding pieces of 20 years later, a child. A little boy, 8 months old, who shared my father's nose and my father's name. I was not consciously thinking about that night as I lay in the dark beside Maya. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and the feeling in my chest was the same feeling. The particular texture of a world coming loose from its moorings. I turned and looked at Maya sleeping. Her face was peaceful. It was the most familiar face I knew. I had drawn it from memory once, early in our relationship, on a napkin at a coffee shop while waiting for her to arrive, not because I was an artist. I am absolutely not an artist, but because I loved her so much I needed to prove to myself I had memorized her. The drawing was terrible. She had laughed until she cried when I showed it to her, then folded it carefully and kept it in her wallet, where I knew it still lived 6 years later because I'd seen it fall out twice. That woman, I was afraid of that woman. I reached over and turned off the lamp on my nightstand and decided to say nothing, watch more, and trust my own judgment about what I found. Which was, I know now, the exact wrong decision. Over the following 2 weeks, I became someone I did not recognize. I want to be clear, I did not go through her phone, I did not follow her. I did not hire anyone or install anything or commit any of the acts of surveillance that people in my position, in the position I believe myself to be in, sometimes commit. I tell you this not because it makes me noble. I tell you this because I want you to understand that you don't have to do any of those things to become unrecognizable to yourself. All you have to do is let the suspicion in, and it will do the work of destroying you all on its own. What I did do. I started paying attention to her in the particular, focused, forensic way that jealousy demands. Every time she was on her phone, I watched her face for micro-expressions of pleasure or secretiveness. Every time she mentioned a colleague's name, I ran it through some internal filter, cataloging the frequency, noting whether she said it casually or with a particular weight. Every time she came home late, I calculated the gap between what she'd told me and what I'd observed, and added it to a running tally in my head that I hated myself for keeping. I started Googling. Not her, I couldn't bring myself to do that. But I Googled things like signs your partner is emotionally cheating, and how to know if something is wrong in your relationship, and how to tell if your girlfriend is pulling away. I read articles at 2 a.m. that were clearly written for the most fragile, most frightened versions of their readers, and I let those articles speak to the most fragile, most frightened version of me. I pulled back from her. This is the part that shames me most when I look back at it now. Because whatever was happening, whatever the truth turned out to be, the thing I did in response to my fear was to make myself smaller and more distant, which created exactly the kind of cold, quiet vacuum in our relationship that makes difficult things harder to say. I stopped reaching for her hand automatically. I stopped sharing the small daily nothings that are the actual substance of a life lived together, the funny thing I saw on the drive home, the weird dream I had, the memory that surfaced for no reason. I stopped initiating affection. I started, God help me, keeping score, tracking who said I love you first, who reached for who in the morning, who made the coffee. She noticed, of course she noticed. Maya was one of the most emotionally perceptive people I had ever known. It was one of the things I had loved most about her, the way she could read a room, read a person, read the invisible weather of an emotional climate. She knew something was wrong with me the way a sailor knows weather is changing, not from any single signal but from the accumulated texture of the air. One evening, about 10 days into my silent unraveling, she looked up from her book and said, "Are you okay?" "Fine," I said, the universal catastrophic lie. She studied me for a moment. "You seem far away." "Just tired." She looked at me for another second, that look she had, the one that meant "I don't believe you but I'm going to let you have this for now," and then went back to her book, and I went back to my silence, and the distance between us on that couch that we had argued about buying grew imperceptibly wider, like a crack in the earth during a slow earthquake, widening not with drama but with terrible patience. The name that snagged my attention was Marcus. She had mentioned him a few times over the preceding month, always in the context of work. Marcus thought the new campaign needed a different color palette. Marcus had a great idea in the brief meeting. Marcus was really talented. She thought the firm was lucky to have hired him 6 months ago. I had listened to these references with half an ear, the way you listen to reports from a world you're not part of, interested because she was interested, no more. But then, in the middle of those 2 weeks, she mentioned him differently. We were driving to her sister's house for Sunday dinner and her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it and smiled that quick, private smile and put it face down on her lap, and then said, unprompted, the way you say something when you're trying to make it sound ordinary, "Marcus is so funny." He sent the funniest meme. "Who's Marcus?" I said. I knew who Marcus was. I asked anyway because I wanted to hear how she described him. "Guy from work, I've mentioned him." Her voice was perfectly easy, perfectly natural. "Right," I said, "the new hire. He's been there 6 months, he's not that new anymore." She was looking out the window, then she turned to me and said, "You'd like him, he's really into old films like you." "Sure," I said. I did not say, "Why are you telling me I'd like him? Why does it matter to you that I'd like him? Why are you preemptively making him likable to me?" I said sure, and I drove, and the quiet between us was full of everything I wasn't saying. And when we got to her sister's house, I watched her laugh at dinner and I thought she seemed lighter than she'd been in weeks. And I didn't know if that was because she'd spent the day with me, or because she'd just received a text from someone whose name I now couldn't hear without something going tight inside my chest. That night I lay awake for a long time. The word that arrived, finally, undeniably, was jealousy. I was jealous. I was jealous of a man I had never met, based on a smile I had observed for less than 2 seconds and a name I had heard perhaps 4 times. The jealousy was hot and specific, and it felt, in the way that shameful feelings often do, like the truest thing about me, like something I had always been carrying and was only now being forced to acknowledge. I thought of my father, of course I thought of my father. And then I went deeper, in the way you do at 3 a.m. when sleep won't come and the mind has nothing better to do than excavate. I thought about how I had spent my entire adult life in deliberate opposition to my father. I had constructed my own character in response to his, built myself to be steady where he was reckless, honest where he was deceptive, present where he had been secretly elsewhere. I had been so proud of this construction, so certain of it. And now here I was, undone by a smile and a name, lying beside the woman I loved and feeling like the enemy. But here's what I understand now that I could not understand then: jealousy is not the same thing as instinct. I had confused the two completely. I had taken a genuine feeling, fear, vulnerability, the old wound of my father's betrayal humming awake in a new context, and dressed it up as insight. I thought my jealousy was seeing something clearly. I thought the fear meant I was right. I was not right. I was just afraid. It was Maya who finally broke through. Not me. I want to be clear about this too because it matters. I was not the one who was brave. I was the one sitting behind my glass wall, watching my relationship deteriorate through the self-sealing logic of suspicion, where every piece of evidence that contradicted my fear could be reinterpreted as further evidence of it, and every silence was confirmation rather than just silence. It was a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the first late night that had started all of this. We were in the kitchen, the ordinary ritual of Saturday morning coffee, and Maya was standing at the counter with her mug in both hands. She always held it in both hands when it was fresh, warming her palms, and she was looking at me with an expression I had not seen before on her face, and she said, "I need to tell you something." The floor fell away. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my own coffee and I felt my whole body go cold and still, the way a deer goes still when it hears something in the woods, and I thought, this is it. This is the moment. I thought I knew exactly what was coming. I had been rehearsing this moment for 3 weeks in the back of my mind, had imagined it dozens of times, written its script in my head in the darkest versions and the slightly less dark versions, had thought about what I would say and whether I would cry and what would happen to the apartment and the couch and the lamp she had rewired herself. Okay, I said. My voice was very calm. I was very calm, the calmness of someone who has given up. She set her mug down. She sat across from me at the table. She looked at her hands for a moment and then she looked at me and her eyes were bright and her expression was not the expression of someone about to confess a betrayal. It was the expression of someone who was scared. I've been lying to you, she said. Not about what you might think, I need you to know that first. But I have been lying to you and I'm so sorry and I think you've been feeling it and I've been watching you get quieter and farther away for weeks and I know it's my fault. And I need to tell you what's actually been happening. I stared at her. Okay, I said again, differently this time. She took a breath, and then Maya, who I had feared was slipping away from me, who I had spent 3 weeks turning into a suspect in the privacy of my own paranoid mind, told me the truth. 6 months ago, her mother had called. I knew Maya's mother, Diane, had met her a dozen times over the years at holidays and birthdays and the occasional Sunday dinner. She was a quiet woman, warm but contained, with Maya's same careful way of choosing words and Maya's same slow, sunrise smile. I had always liked her. What I did not know, what Maya had been carrying alone since that phone call 6 months ago, was that Diane had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. She told me this quietly, without drama, the way people tell things they have been carrying too long, not with a flood but with a kind of exhausted release, like setting down something heavy you didn't realize you were still holding. She made me promise not to tell anyone, Maya said. She is so afraid of being treated differently, of people looking at her like she's already gone. She begged me. And I know it was wrong to keep it from you, I know that, but she's my mom and she was crying on the phone and I said yes. I was very still. The late nights, Maya continued, I've been helping her. She's been having trouble with paperwork, bills, her insurance. She gets confused and she gets upset about getting confused. And sometimes I go over there after work and just help her sort through things, and sometimes it takes longer than I expected. And then it's late and I come home and I just don't. I didn't know how to explain where I'd been without explaining everything, and I wasn't ready to explain everything. And so I just said work and I hated myself for it every single time. She was crying now, quietly, the tears running without drama, without the face crumpling of theatrical crying, just her eyes filling and spilling. And Marcus from my work, she said, and paused to wipe her face with the back of her hand. His father went through something similar 2 years ago. I've been talking to him about it. How to research care options, how to handle the hard conversations, how to not completely fall apart while still showing up for work. He's been really kind about it. And I know how that might look, I know how it must have seemed, me texting him and smiling at my phone and being weird about it, but I swear to you, Daniel, I swear. Stop, I said. She stopped. I got up from the table. I went around to her side and I crouched down in front of her chair so that I was below her, looking up, and I took her hands in mine. They were cold, the way hands go cold when someone has been frightened for a long time, and I held them and she looked at me with her eyes full of tears and I thought, you have been carrying this alone for 6 months. 6 months. And I spent 3 weeks turning it into a story about betrayal. We talked for 4 hours that Saturday morning. The coffee went cold. The light moved across the kitchen floor the way it does on long mornings when time is behaving differently than usual, stretching out around the important things. We talked, and Maya cried, and then I cried, ugly, heaving cries that surprised me with their force, as though something that had been sealed under enormous pressure for a very long time had finally found its opening. I told her about the jealousy, all of it, how it had felt like certainty when it was actually just fear, how I had watched her and catalogued her and turned her into a suspect without ever giving her the chance to be a person with a secret reason. Because people who love us have secret reasons sometimes, reasons that have nothing to do with betrayal and everything to do with the unbearable complexity of being alive. I told her about my father. I had told her pieces of the story before, but not the whole thing, not the texture of it, the specific quality of that Tuesday night when I was 11 and the walls of the world came loose. I told it all now, or tried to, stumbling through it with my hands still wrapped around hers, and she listened the way Maya always listened, fully and without interrupting, her eyes on my face. So when things felt like they were shifting, I said, when I felt you pulling away, my brain went straight to the worst version. The version I already knew was possible, not because of anything you did but because I had evidence from before from someone else, and I let that evidence apply to you and I am so sorry. She was quiet for a moment. I should have told you, she said. I know I should have told you. I kept telling myself I was protecting her and I was protecting her, but I think I was also scared of needing help. Of you seeing me fall apart about this. Because falling apart about this means it's real, and if it's real. She didn't finish the sentence, she didn't need to. It is real, I said, and you're not falling apart. You've been holding it together for 6 months, and I shook my head, that's so much. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against mine, and we sat like that for a long moment in the Saturday morning light, and I could feel her breathing, slower now, the shallow, frightened breathing giving way to something deeper, something that felt like relief. I should have trusted you, she said. I should have asked, I said. These two things, the thing she should have done and the thing I should have done, were not in competition with each other. They were both true at once. The way two people can fail each other simultaneously, can each be doing their best with their damage and their fear and still end up standing on opposite sides of a silence that grew larger than either of them intended. I want to talk about what jealousy actually is, because I spent so long misunderstanding it. I think I believed, in some inexamined part of myself, that jealousy was a kind of vision, that it sharpened perception, that the painful alertness of it meant I was seeing clearly, that the fear of losing something was the same as accurately perceiving a threat to it. But jealousy isn't vision, jealousy is a wound talking. In my case, the wound was 20 years old. It was a small boy sitting at a kitchen table being told that the architecture of his world was built on a lie, and learning from that moment, deep in the body, below the level of conscious thought, that love is a place where the floor can disappear without warning, that the people who are supposed to be the most solid become the least reliable. That you cannot fully trust the evidence of your ordinary life, because ordinary life is exactly what deception hides behind. I had built my adult self on top of that wound and never quite acknowledged that the wound was still there, still informing my responses to the world, still primed to recognize or manufacture the shape of betrayal. Maya was not my father. She was never going to be my father. She was a woman in pain who made the mistake of trying to handle that pain privately, which is the most human mistake in the world, which is the mistake of someone who has learned at some point in their own life that falling apart in front of people means burdening people, means being difficult, means asking for something that might not be given. We were both running old software on a new situation, and the old software was making us see threats where there were none and walls where there was no reason for walls. We went to see Diane that afternoon. Maya called her first from the car while I drove. I heard only Maya's side of the conversation, soft, careful, the voice she used with her mother, which was a little slower and a little lighter than her regular voice, with more patience in it than I had ever quite noticed before. She asked how the morning had been. She asked if the aide she'd arranged had come. She said we were coming for lunch. She said to leave the dishes, they'd do them together. When we arrived, Diane was in the kitchen. She'd already started the dishes despite being told not to, which Maya took with a gentle, exasperated laugh and gently took the sponge from her hands. I sat down at Diane's kitchen table while Maya washed up, and Diane sat across from me, and for a moment she just looked at me with her clear eyes and her careful expression. And I thought about what Maya had said, she's afraid of being looked at like she's already gone, and I made a point of looking at her the way I always had. It's good to see you, Diane, I said. You too, Daniel, she said, then quietly in her measured way, she told you. She told me. Diane nodded slowly, looking at her hands on the table. I made her keep it secret too long, I know that. She loves you, I said. She was doing what you asked. Yes, a pause, but love isn't very good at secrets, they always cost something. She looked up at me then, and there was something in her eyes, sharp and knowing and a little sad, that made me understand that whatever else the illness would take from her, it had not taken this. Has it cost you too something? A little, I said honestly, we're paying it back. She looked at me for a moment longer and then she nodded once, and that was the end of it, the way she always ended things that had been said fully enough, with a single nod and a return to the practical. Good, she said. Now, will you eat? I made too much chicken. We ate too much chicken. That was 4 months ago. Here is what has happened in the 4 months since that Saturday morning. Maya and I started therapy together. Not because we were broken, I want to be precise about this, but because we recognized that we had both spent years being shaped by things that had happened to us before we knew each other, and that those things had quietly been making decisions in our relationship without our consent, and we wanted to at least be in the room for those decisions going forward. Our therapist is a small, direct woman named Dr. Ackafer who has the precise and useful quality of being completely unimpressed by our attempts to sound reasonable when we are actually being defensive. She is a very good therapist. In therapy, I learned some things about myself that were uncomfortable to learn. I learned that my security, the quality Maya had loved in me early on, the quality I had worn so proudly, was not actually security. It was something more complicated, a studied performance of security built over an insecure foundation, a careful construction of composure that worked perfectly well under ordinary conditions but had no resilience to actual pressure. Real security, Dr. Ackafer explained with characteristic bluntness, doesn't crumble when your partner starts coming home late. Real security asks what's wrong. Performed security watches in silence and builds a case. I had been performing security for 20 years. I did not know how to feel actually secure because I did not yet know how to sit with the fear that something could be taken from me without converting that fear into suspicion and distance. This is long work. It does not happen in a Saturday morning conversation or even in 4 months of twice-monthly therapy sessions. It is the work of learning to tolerate vulnerability, which is another way of saying learning to tolerate love. Because love in its truest form requires you to be afraid to hold something precious and know it is not invulnerable, and to stay present in that fear rather than armoring against it. I am learning. I am slow at it, but I am learning. Maya has been learning too. Hers is the work of letting people in, of understanding that carrying pain alone is not strength. It is a particular kind of loneliness dressed up as independence. She grew up in a household with a father who had significant depression, and the family's unspoken contract was that you did not add to the heaviness. You managed your own burdens quietly, you put on your functional face, you did not want things from people who were already struggling to carry their own weight. She brought that contract into our relationship without knowing she'd brought it. I thought I was protecting you, she told me one evening after a session. When my mom called and told me about the diagnosis, my first thought was genuinely, I don't want Daniel to have to carry this. As though your love for me was a limited resource I had to be careful not to draw down. You thought my love had a ceiling, I said. She thought about this? I thought love had a ceiling, she said. I thought everyone's did because it had to, because if it didn't have a ceiling, how could my dad have? She stopped. This was her wound, the same structural shape as mine but different in its specifics. A father who loved her but whose love had been limited by his illness, who had not always had the emotional reserves to meet her needs, who had taught her without meaning to that to ask for too much was to risk finding the limit of someone's capacity for you. Two people, two old wounds, one apartment with a cream-colored living room and a thrift store lamp and a couch they'd argued over buying. Finding each other in the places where their damage overlapped, which is also to say, finding each other full stop. Because we always find each other in those places. The overlap between wounds is where intimacy lives. Diana's doing okay. This is not a story with a fairy tale resolution for her because Alzheimer's doesn't work that way. It progresses. Some days are better than others. There was a Tuesday 2 months ago when she called Maya by her sister's name 3 times and then got very quiet and very sad in the particular way she gets when she understands in those moments of clarity what is happening to her. Maya stayed with her for 5 hours that day. I drove over in the evening with dinner. We have become, the three of us, a small team. Maya manages the care coordination, the medical appointments, the aid scheduling, the paperwork that used to pile up and overwhelm Diane, and I manage the practical backup. Driving when needed, coming to sit with Diane when Maya needs a break, making more food than we need and leaving portions in Diane's freezer. It's not glamorous work. It's the work of love in its operational form, specific, repetitive, showing up. Maya's sister knows now, and her brother. The family came together around this as families sometimes do when the thing they've been avoiding finally has to be named. There were some hard conversations. There was some grief. There is still grief. There will always be grief from here. But they are not alone with it anymore. And that, I think, is the thing. I titled this piece the way I titled it because I think the wrongness matters. Not as self-flagellation, I have done enough of that, but because the specific nature of what I got wrong feels important to name. I thought I was jealous. I was scared. These are not the same thing, though they present identically from the inside. Jealousy says, she is choosing something else over you. Fear says, something is being taken from you and you cannot stop it. Both produce the same symptoms, the watchfulness, the withdrawal, the way the mind keeps returning to the threat like a tongue to a sore tooth. But they have different causes and they require different responses. If I had been capable of identifying what I was feeling as fear rather than jealousy, I would have handled it differently. Not perfectly, I am a person, not a process, but differently. I might have sat down with Maya in that first week and said the true thing: I feel like something is wrong and I'm scared, and I need you to help me understand what I'm feeling. Instead, I identified my fear as jealousy and my jealousy as righteous, and I used both to justify a silence that made everything worse. I was also wrong about what love looks like under pressure. I believed this so deeply it was closer to doctrine than thought, that love was a stable state. A thing you either had or didn't have, a settled condition of security and certainty that, if disturbed, was a sign that something was broken. I understood intellectually that relationships required work, but I had not really integrated what that meant. Work meant communication and date nights and not taking each other for granted. Work did not mean the grinding, unglamorous, uncomfortable labor of sitting with your own fears and numbing them out loud and being wrong and admitting it and starting again. Real love is not a stable state. It's a practice. It's something you do repeatedly under conditions that are not always favorable, with a person whose own damage is sometimes incompatible with your own in ways that require patience and repair. It is not the grand gesture, though the grand gesture has its place, but the thousand small acts of turning toward each other rather than away. The willingness to be uncomfortable. The willingness to ask the question even when you're afraid of the answer. I was also wrong about my father, or rather, about the lesson I had taken from my father. I had learned from his betrayal that love was unreliable, that the floor could disappear, that you could not trust the ordinary surface of a shared life because deception lives precisely in the ordinary. This was a reasonable conclusion for an 11-year-old to draw from the evidence available to him. It was a survival mechanism, a way of staying alert in a world that had proven unsafe. But I had never updated it. I had never let new evidence revise the old conclusion. I had met Maya, who was honest, sometimes painfully so, who had never given me a real reason to doubt her, who loved me with a consistency and attentiveness that should have been sufficient proof, and I had loved her completely while simultaneously keeping one foot braced against the floor, disappearing, just in case. The tragedy of unexamined wounds is that they make us rehearse the injury. They orient us toward the threat we already know so that we keep finding it or thinking we find it, even in its absence. My father's story was not Maya's story. It never was. There is an ordinary Tuesday morning I want to tell you about, because I think ordinary Tuesday mornings might be the actual subject of this whole story. It's about 6 weeks after the Saturday when Maya told me the truth. We are in our kitchen, which is the same kitchen it has always been, and I am making eggs and she is making coffee, and there is music playing from her phone. She always plays music in the morning, a playlist she made called Soft Mornings that is mostly old jazz and occasional ambient things that drift through the apartment like weather. She is telling me about a dream she had. The dream is long and elaborate and not very interesting in the way that dreams often aren't when you hear them secondhand, but she tells it with the total commitment she brings to all stories, making the dream logic sound reasonable, defending the choices of her dream self with a seriousness that makes me laugh. I am laughing and flipping eggs, and she is leaning against the counter with her coffee in both hands still always, to warm her palms, and the morning light is coming through the window and there is nothing remarkable happening here. This is what I almost lost. Not the dramatic version of love, not the intensity of early falling, not the passion of the long-avoided argument finally having, not the catharsis of the hard conversation that needed to happen. Those things matter, but this is the thing that gets taken first when suspicion moves in: the easiness. The capacity to stand in your kitchen on a Tuesday morning and laugh at a dream and make eggs and not be performing anything, not managing anything, not watching or cataloging or waiting for the floor to disappear. The capacity to just be here. I had been starving myself of this for weeks without knowing it. I had been so focused on what might be wrong that I had stopped inhabiting what was right. And what was right was this: a woman I loved in a kitchen that was ours, telling me a stupid dream over coffee and the whole unheroic miracle of an ordinary morning. She catches me looking at her. "What?" she says. "Nothing," I say. Your dream is very confusing." "You weren't listening." "I was listening. Your old school turned into a submarine. After the escalator scene, if you were listening you would have asked about the escalator. What happened on the escalator?" She takes a breath, preparing to retell the whole thing, and I turn the eggs off and lean against the counter beside her and listen. And outside the kitchen window the city is doing its ordinary Tuesday morning things: traffic, birds, someone's dog, the specific quality of light on a day in early spring, and I am here, and she is here, and the floor is solid under my feet. This is what I was wrong about, this is what I almost missed. Not a conspiracy, not a betrayal, not the story I had already written for myself about how love ends. Just this. Epilogue for the person reading this at 2 a.m. I don't know who you are, but I think I know why you're here. You're here because something feels off and you don't know what it is. You're here because you've been watching someone you love and trying to read the signals and coming up with an answer that fills you with dread. You're here because the fear got in, and once the fear gets in, the mind wants something to do with it, wants to shape it into a story. Give it a name, find its logic, make it graspable, and the story the fear wants to tell is almost always the worst one. I want to say this clearly because I wish someone had said it to me. The story fear tells is not always true. Sometimes, often, what looks like distance is someone drowning quietly in something they don't know how to ask for help with. Sometimes what looks like secrecy is shame. Sometimes what looks like coldness is exhaustion. Sometimes what looks like a relationship ending is actually a relationship hitting one of the walls that all relationships eventually hit. The places where two people's unexamined lives collide and make friction, and the friction looks like failure, but it's actually just the work that needs to be done. Fear does not disqualify you from love, it does not make you damaged or too much or not enough. It makes you human. It makes you someone who has been hurt before, who learned from that hurt the way we all learn from hurt, not always correctly, but genuinely with whatever tools were available at the time. But fear needs to be named. That's the thing. Fear that isn't named becomes jealousy, becomes suspicion, becomes silence, becomes the cold and growing distance that you then mistake for confirmation that your fear was right. It becomes self-fulfilling. It eats the very thing you were trying to protect. So if you are up at 2 a.m. reading this because something is wrong, let me ask you the question I wish I had asked myself. Is this jealousy or is this fear? And if it's fear, when it's fear, can you find the courage to say so? Not to perform vulnerability, not to seem emotionally sophisticated, but because the person you love deserves to know what is actually happening inside you. Because you deserve to be known. Because the story you're telling alone in your head at 2 a.m. is almost certainly incomplete, and the only way to complete it is to say it out loud to the person it concerns in the daylight. It is terrifying, I know it is terrifying, the floor might disappear. But the floor is more likely to hold than you think. And if you never step onto it, you will spend your whole life standing at the edge of the room, watching the life you want from a careful distance, staying safe in the way that is actually the most dangerous of all. Safe from hurt, yes, but safe from everything else too. That night after we came home from Diane's, after the chicken, after the dishes we washed together, after Diane showed Maya something on her phone and they laughed the same laugh in the same key, after we drove home with the windows down because it was one of the first warm evenings of the year, Maya and I sat on the couch that I used to think was too expensive. She was leaning into me, her head on my shoulder, and we were not watching television. Just sitting in the quiet apartment with the lamp she had rewired herself and the cream-colored walls she had chosen from 17 swatches and the accumulated weight of a life built carefully by two imperfect people. "Are you okay?" she asked. The same question she had asked 3 weeks earlier when I had said fine and meant I am disappearing and I don't know how to tell you. This time I thought about it. "I think so," I said, "I think I'm getting there." She turned her head to look up at me. "What does getting there feel like?" I thought about it again. Outside, a car passed. The lamp threw its warm light over the room. "Like being here," I said, "like actually being here." She was quiet for a moment, and then she found my hand and held it, and I held hers back, and the city went on doing its city things outside our window, and we stayed. For everyone who has ever turned fear into a story and the story into a wall, the door is still there. You just have to be the one to open it. The end.